On graduation night, a will trembled in my hand. $10 million to do the right thing. A week later, I signed papers even my law student ex couldn't decipher. Now, 3 years on, as head of compliance at Orion Freight Systems, I watch from my glass office as the people who once laughed at me prepare to dig their own graves. They think I have a report, I have a trust, and the noose that tightens the moment they lie. My name is Claire Arden. 3 years ago, at the age of 29, I was bequeathed an inheritance that felt less like a gift and more like a court summons. It came from my grandparents, two people who had lived their lives in the quiet, unassuming town of Elmsbrook, a place where right and wrong were as clearly defined as the property lines between manicured lawns. The document, presented to me by our family lawyer, Mr. Gable, in his stuffy Boston office that smelled of old paper and peppermint, was brutally simple. $10 million, held in a portfolio of assets so conservative they had barely weathered inflation, and beneath the sum, a single, handwritten clause that served as the anchor to the entire fortune, to be used only to right what is wrong. Mr. Gable, a man whose professional comfort zone was a well-diversified mutual fund, cleared his throat. "Claire," he began, his voice a gentle, paternal hum. "Your grandparents were practical people. This is a poetic, but legally ambiguous, directive. The simplest interpretation is to invest this wisely, live a good life, and perhaps endow a scholarship in their name, a hospital wing, something tangible, safe." He slid a glossy brochure for a blue-chip investment firm across his mahogany desk. The faces on the cover were smiling, confident, promising secure, predictable growth. They promised a future free of worry. I looked at the brochure, then at the will, the ink of my grandmother's cursive, the forceful period my grandfather had stabbed at the end of the sentence. This wasn't a suggestion for a comfortable life. It was a weapon, and they had just handed it to me, trusting I would know how to aim. "I have another idea. Mr. Gable," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the frantic calculus spinning in my mind. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I'm listening." What I proposed wasn't in any of his brochures. It was a structure I had spent the last 2 years of business school secretly designing, a theoretical model I never dared present in a classroom. I called it the Camden Remnant Trust. On the surface, it was a charitable remainder trust, a perfectly respectable, tax-efficient vehicle. Its public-facing mission was to fund vocational training for displaced workers, but buried deep within its charter, cross-referenced in appendices that were a nightmare of legalese, was its true function, a mechanism to acquire controlling stakes in the debt of ethically compromised corporations. It was a vulture fund with a conscience, designed not to liquidate assets for profit, but to seize control by leveraging a company's own corruption against it. "Mr. Gable's face went from paternal to pale. "Claire, this is unorthodox, aggressive. You would be placing your entire inheritance into an instrument of immense risk. Who would even manage such a thing?" "The co-founder and trustee is a fiduciary based in North Verity," I explained, naming a fictional city to protect the true location. "All communication is encrypted. My identity as the benefactor is shielded by a Delaware shell corporation. I will be a ghost in the machine." He shook his head, looking at me as if I were a stranger. "But how does it act? What triggers this acquisition mechanism?" This was the masterstroke, the heart of the entire design. "The trust is legally bound to remain dormant," I said, the words feeling cold and solid in the warm office. "It is prohibited from acting unless a specific breach event is independently verified." I slid a single sheet of paper toward him, containing the core clause. A breach event is defined as substantiated evidence of systemic financial misrepresentation, coercive labor practices, or environmental compliance fraud, and the verification must come from a single designated source, a sworn affidavit from a non-beneficiary, certified compliance officer with direct internal knowledge of the offending corporation. Mr. Gable read the clause twice. So, you need an inside whistleblower to activate this $10 million cannon? Precisely, I said. I didn't add the final piece, the one that made the trap perfect. The compliance officer who would one day sign that affidavit would be me. The structure ensured there was no conflict of interest. As an employee, I wouldn't benefit financially from the trust's activation. I would only be the catalyst. I would be the key turning in a lock I had built years before. Boston was a city of glittering opportunities for a top graduate. A major consulting firm had offered me a starting package that made my classmates envious. The path was laid out: a high-rise apartment, a European car, a life measured in quarterly bonuses. I turned it down without a second thought. My target was not in Boston. It was 300 miles away in Rivermont, a gritty, industrial city built on the back of logistics and shadowed by rumors. My target was Orion Freight Systems. Orion was a market darling. Its stock soared, its profits were robust, and its CEO was a fixture at every civic charity event. But if you listened closely in the industry bars, if you read between the lines of the local news reports, you heard whispers. Whispers of impossible delivery schedules, of overworked drivers and dock workers, of regulators who seemed to look the other way at the city's busiest port. It was a company with a clean public face and a dirty private life. It was perfect. I didn't apply for a high-level strategy role. I aimed lower, for a position in the one department everyone tries to avoid: corporate compliance. It was seen as a cost center, a bureaucratic bottleneck. It was also the company's central nervous system, the place where every dirty secret was eventually translated into sanitized legal language. For the year leading up to my application, my nights were not spent celebrating my degree. They were spent in the deep, unlit corners of financial databases. I studied Orion's capital structure, focusing on their B-rated corporate bonds. The riskier, the higher yield debt that banks and major funds were less keen on. I mapped the path of their debt, who held it, when it was traded, and which covenants, if broken, could trigger a default. I learned the names of the key figures in their finance and operations departments, memorizing their career histories, their connections, their rumored weaknesses. I was preparing for an infiltration, and I would not be going in unarmed. The day the trust was finalized was quiet and anticlimactic, in a different lawyer's office, one more anonymous and less judgmental than Mr. Gables. I signed the final transfer document. $10 million vanished from my name. It ceased to be my money and became ammunition. In its place, I would receive a modest annual income from the trust's non-aggressive investments, enough to live on without raising suspicion. A comfortable salary for a mid-level compliance officer. My control over the principal was gone, surrendered to the rigid, predatory logic of the machine I had built. The power wasn't in spending the money. It was in the conditions under which it would be deployed: the voting rights, the ability to call the debt, the power to force a restructuring. All of it lay dormant, locked behind a trigger only I could pull. I remember my graduation night with perfect, detached clarity. The air was thick with champagne and the bright, brittle sound of forced optimism. My peers, dressed in rented gowns and cloaked in student debt, clinked glasses and talked about their futures in abstract, glowing terms. They were celebrating the end of their education. I was quietly commencing mine. I found a quiet corner near a window overlooking the campus lawns. The celebration a muted thrum through the glass. I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, the weight of the moment pressing down. Then, I typed a short, simple email to the anonymous trustee in North Verity, the one whose real name I would never know. The subject line was "Final Directive." The body of the message was only 10 words. "Lock the activation clause. Do not open without my signature." I hit send. The trap was set. The bait was my own life, my own career, and for the next 3 years, I would work to become the perfect, unassuming employee, waiting patiently for the monster to show its teeth, so I could show it mine. Orion Freight Systems resided on the top 10 floors of the Sterling Point Tower, a monument of smoked glass and steel that pierced the often gray Rivermont sky. The lobby was an exercise in corporate minimalism. a vast expanse of polished Brazilian hardwood that reflected the recessed lighting with a watery, sterile gleam. Everything was designed to communicate effortless efficiency and unshakable stability. The air itself seemed filtered, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive cleaning products. Even the automated coffee machine in the seventh-floor kitchenette operated with clinical precision. Its hiss and drip as it dispensed burnt-tasting coffee sounded like a digital hourglass counting down billable seconds. The place was as clean as an operating theater, and I suspected, just as accustomed to blood being wiped away before anyone noticed. The king of this sterile kingdom was Victor Hale, the CEO. Victor had a smile that belonged on a calendar, perfectly white and calibrated for maximum shareholder reassurance. He was a master of the firm handshake, the concerned nod, the resonant soundbite for the Rivermont Gazette. I saw him most often in press photos, one arm slung around the mayor, the other pointing toward a new, philanthropically funded youth center. He was the face of Orion's pristine public image, a man who seemed to genuinely believe in the mission statements that were laser-etched into the glass walls of the conference rooms. He was a beautiful, hollow vessel. If Victor was the face, Marla Quinn, the CFO, was the iron spine. She was a woman who communicated primarily through spreadsheets and wore pointed-toe shoes so sharp they looked like they could puncture the floor. She spoke in clipped, precise sentences, reducing every operational challenge to a quantifiable metric. A conversation with Marla was an audit. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence was a weaponized absence of sound, a void into which you felt compelled to spill your insecurities and errors. She was feared, respected, and utterly unreadable. She was the gatekeeper of the numbers, and I knew that whatever corruption existed at Orion, it would, sooner or later, pass through her desk, disguised as a rounding error or a justifiable expense. My entry point into this world was Darren Cole, the vice president of operations. He was assigned to be my mentor, a role he embraced with a disarming, folksy charm. On my first day, he walked me through the office, introducing me with a booming voice, making jokes about the terrible coffee, and explaining the unwritten rules of the company. He was in his late 50s, with a weary but kind face, and he spoke often of his daughter's college tuition. He seemed like a relic from a different, more human era of business. "This place can be a bit intense," he told me, leaning against my cubicle wall. "Just keep your head down, do the work, and you'll be fine. You seem sharp, Claire. You'll do great." A week into the job, I was locked out of a shared server. Darren came to my rescue, swiping his own master badge to grant me access. He called it and requested a temporary keycard for me while they sorted out my credentials. An hour later, a plain white badge was on my desk. "Here you go," he'd said. "Just a spare from my desk. Should get you everywhere you need to go. I'll grab it back from you tomorrow." He never asked for it back. It sat in the bottom of my desk drawer, a small, forgotten piece of plastic, a key I was never meant to have, offered with a smile. The whispers started about a month in. You'd hear them in the break room, by the elevators, in the hushed tones people used after Marla Quinn had swept past. They were about Landry Cove, the port facility that handled a significant portion of Orion's international freight. The official line was that Orion had a strategic partnership with the Port Authority, allowing for expedited processing of their priority shipments. This was presented as a triumph of logistics. The unofficial understanding was that Orion's containers were rarely, if ever, flagged for secondary inspection. They moved through the port like ghosts, their contents a matter of faith rather than verification. More whispers followed, these from the logistics coordinators and warehouse supervisors. The people who worked long past the glow of the office lights had faded. They spoke of overtime that was never paid, only banked as comp time that was impossible to actually take. When someone finally made a formal complaint, an email had come down from the legal department. It stated, with breathtaking cynicism, that extra hours were entirely optional, yet everyone knew that the workload made them anything but. It was a quiet, systemic form of wage theft, papered over with corporate doublespeak. This was the second condition of the Trust's charter: coercive labor practices. My own role in this theater was meticulously crafted. I was the diligent, slightly overwhelmed new hire in compliance. I asked the right questions, took copious notes in meetings, and never challenged a superior's opinion directly. My first major assignment, handed to me by Darren himself, was a perfect piece of misdirection. I was to conduct a 6-month internal review of Orion's Green Route initiative. It was a PR campaign made manifest, a program designed to reduce the company's carbon footprint by optimizing trucking routes and investing in more fuel-efficient engines. It was exactly the kind of tedious, data-heavy project that no ambitious executive would ever want. For weeks, I buried myself in fuel invoices, maintenance logs, and GPS tracking data. I created charts. I generated preliminary reports filled with encouraging, meaningless jargon. I played the part of a loyal corporate citizen, determined to help Orion save the planet, one truck at a time. But as I dug deeper, a dissonant note began to sound, faint at first, then growing impossible to ignore. According to the company's own promotional materials, the Green Route program should have resulted in a net decrease in diesel fuel consumption of at least 8% for the fiscal year. But the invoices told a different story. The raw numbers, hidden beneath layers of departmental summaries and projected savings, showed that Orion's diesel purchases had actually increased by 4%. It made no sense. It was a physical impossibility unless something was fundamentally wrong with the data or the program itself was a lie. I started cross-referencing the invoices with specific routes, focusing on the ones originating from Landry Cove. That's when I found it. It was a small thing, an anomaly that most people would have dismissed as a clerical error. A fuel invoice for a third-party trucking contractor, one that serviced the port exclusively. The invoice was for an amount that was unusually high, but what caught my eye was the file's properties. I right-clicked, pulled up the details. The metadata fields, author, last modified by, date created, were all blank, wiped clean. It was the digital equivalent of sanding off a serial number. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had not just made a mistake, they had actively erased their tracks. They had taken a small, inconvenient piece of the truth and carefully, deliberately, scraped it away. I stared at the blank fields on my monitor, the hum of the server room a low thrum in the background. The polished facade of Orion Freight Systems had just shown its first crack, and I had my finger on the edge of it, ready to pull. The whole thing was a lie, and someone had just handed me the proof. The legal architecture of the Camden Remnant Trust was not a blunt instrument. It was a scalpel, designed for a single, precise incision. It did not own Orion's debt. It owned the option to purchase that debt, specifically the tranches of B-rated bonds that were most sensitive to market panic. This option was a sleeping giant, legally bound by a covenant that was my own masterpiece of malicious compliance. It could only be awakened by a verified standards breach event. I had defined this event with the cold, unforgiving clarity of a statute. It wasn't a vague accusation of wrongdoing. It was a tripartite definition, requiring material proof of one or more of the following. First, systemic misrepresentation in corporate reporting, a category under which the fraudulent Green Route data fit perfectly. Second, the implementation of coercive labor practices, such as the systematic denial of earned overtime. Third, the demonstrable evasion of environmental inspection protocols, the ghost containers of Landry Cove. Each of these was a pillar of Orion's profitability. Each was a tripwire I was meticulously documenting. The true genius, however, was not in the definition of the breach, but in the chain of authentication I had constructed to verify it. It was an irreversible, public process designed to be unimpeachable. It began with me, but it did not end with me. The first step was the compilation of an internal report, a dossier of evidence, invoices, logs, internal emails, that I was slowly assembling. This dossier would be encrypted with a key so complex It would take a government agency years to break. The private decryption key would not be in my possession. It would be lodged with a bonded notary public in a quiet office on the other side of Rivermont, sealed in a tamper-proof digital wallet with a time-stamped affidavit. That notary was legally instructed to do nothing. They were a vault, the key to that vault. The action that would compel the notary to release the decryption key to the trust's legal team was the second and most critical step. My filing of a formal public whistleblower complaint with the Corinth State Transportation Commission, the state's primary regulatory body for freight and logistics. This was the point of no return. The moment my name, Claire Arden, was attached to a public accusation, the trigger was pulled. The public nature of the filing would instantly create a legal and media firestorm, but it also served as the undeniable, independent verification the trust's charter required. The notary would receive an automated alert the second the filing appeared on the Commission's public docket. The lock would open. Once activated, the sequence would be swift and brutal. As news of the investigation hit the financial wires, Orion's bond prices would plummet. That was the moment the Camden Remnant Trust would execute its options, purchasing a controlling stake in the company's vulnerable debt for pennies on the dollar. Suddenly, a faceless charitable trust would become one of Orion's largest creditors. With that position came power, the legal right to demand an emergency restructuring, to veto executive bonus packages, and most importantly, to claim an observer's seat on the board of directors. They wouldn't be able to make a single strategic move without my proxy in the room. But I had built a fail-safe within the weapon. A second, invisible clause was embedded in the trust's recovery mandate. It stipulated that in the event of a successful restructuring, 20% of all profits generated from the sale of acquired assets or debt-to-equity conversion must be transferred directly into a newly formed entity, the Orion Employee Welfare Fund. It was, for all intents and purposes, a stealth employee stock ownership trust, ESOT. It was designed to shield the rank-and-file workers from the inevitable layoffs and austerity measures of a typical corporate takeover. It would provide severance, retraining grants, and eventually, a shared ownership stake in the leaner, cleaner company that emerged. It was the fulfillment of my grandparents' will, not just to punish the wrong, but to protect the innocent. To the world, to the company, to everyone. I was just Claire Arden, compliance officer, employee number 71B9. But within the encrypted charter of the trust, I was designated by a single, sterile title, the Protector. My digital signature, the final authorization for any major action taken by the trust's anonymous managers, was stored on a cold wallet, a small, featureless USB drive that never once touched an internet-connected device. It lived in a safety deposit box 5 towns over, under a false name. Claire Arden signed off on expense reports. The Protector held the kill switch for $1 billion corporation. The two were never to meet. My life at Orion became a masterclass in calculated mediocrity. I learned to speak the language of the harmless corporate functionary. I asked about people's weekends. I brought in donuts on my birthday. I perfected a look of mild confusion in meetings where complex financial instruments were discussed. I made small talk in the elevator, occasionally feigning a slight nervousness when it ascended too quickly. A relatable, human flaw. On my meticulously tidy desk, I placed a single, small cactus in a terracotta pot. It was a cliché, the kind of plant a person with no real personality or passion would choose. But to me, it was a reminder, a living thing that thrived on neglect in a hostile environment. My most important performance was for Darren Cole. He was my direct line to the operational rot I was investigating, and I needed him to see me as completely benign, every week, like clockwork. I sent him 3 emails. They were always on the same topic: minor updates to OSHA safety checklists. Darren, just flagging that Regulation 1910.178M5I for forklift operations has a new clarification from the regional office. No action needed, just for your awareness. Darren, FYI, Attached is the updated poster for hazardous material handling. Can you confirm it's been distributed to the Landry Cove supervisors? Darren, a quick question about the Q3 safety audit schedule. They were informational, necessary, and profoundly boring. I was conditioning him. I was training his brain to associate an email from Claire Arden with the mental effort of swatting away a fly. I was becoming background noise. He would see my name. His eyes would glaze over, and he would archive the message without a second thought. This was the core of my strategy. The trap wasn't the meticulously crafted legal document held by a notary. It wasn't the $10 million waiting to be deployed. The trap was the 3 years of routine. It was the pleasant good mornings, the shared complaints about the coffee, the hundreds of utterly forgettable emails. They were all looking for a threat in a prospectus, a hostile filing from a rival firm. They would never think to look for it in the quiet, predictable habits of the most boring woman in the compliance department. They would never see it coming, because I had made it my job to be invisible. The first move against me wasn't a formal reprimand or a hostile email. It was an invitation. Darren Cole appeared at my cubicle late on a Thursday afternoon, leaning against the partition with his usual weary smile. The office was emptying out, the fading sunlight striping the floor through the enormous windows. "Hey, Claire," he said, his tone casual. "A few of us from Ops are heading over to Dock 14 for a beer. You should come. Loosen up a bit." Dock 14 was a noisy, cavernous bar by the riverfront, smelling of stale beer and fried fish. A place where logistics managers and dock workers drank side by side. It was Darren's territory. I accepted, playing the part of the appreciative subordinate. For an hour, I listened to him tell stories about the old days of shipping, before everything was automated. He was charming, self-deprecating. Then, as the crowd thinned, he lowered his voice. "You know, my youngest, Sarah? She got into Cornell," he said, staring into his beer as if the future were swirling in the foam. "Early decision, smart kid, but that tuition, it's a killer, a real killer." He looked up at me, his eyes tired but sincere. "That's why we do this, right? All these hours, all this stress, it's for them." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt paternal, conspiratorial. It was a perfectly delivered performance of the struggling family man, designed to elicit sympathy, to build a bond. I nodded, offered my congratulations, and felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. He was establishing his motive before he'd even committed the crime. The following Tuesday, the knife came out. I had a meeting in my calendar, a mandatory weekly sync-up about Landry Cove logistics. When I walked to the conference room on the 48th floor, the glass door was closed. I could see the entire operations leadership team inside, their forms blurred by the frosted glass. I tried my keycard. Access denied. A red light blinked with impersonal finality. I stood there for a moment. The rejection a small, public humiliation. Darren's assistant, a nervous young woman who always seemed to be apologizing, scurried out a few minutes later. "Oh, Claire, I'm so sorry," she stammered, avoiding my eyes. "There was a last-minute change. It's a senior-level strategic review now. Darren said he'd catch you up later." He never did. I was being cut out of the information loop, surgically and silently. The next day, the real attack began. An email from Marla Quinn landed in my inbox. The subject was simply, "For review." There was no greeting, no explanation, just a single, password-protected zip file attached. I typed in the standard departmental password. Inside was a folder containing a dozen documents, mostly shipping manifests and insurance riders. It was a typical compliance spot check, but one file was different. It was a subcontractor agreement with a company I'd never heard of, Seawind Apex LLC. The contract was thin, barely 3 pages, and granted Seawind Apex exclusive rights to handle specialized cargo logistics for certain priority shipments out of Landry Cove. The terms were suspiciously vague, the payment structure unusually generous. It felt wrong. It felt like a cutout, a shell company created to handle the business Orion didn't want on its official books. I did what I had been trained to do. I right-clicked the document and opened the file properties. The metadata told a chilling story. The document's original author, the creator of the file, was listed as Cole Darren. The creation date was from 6 months ago, but the last modified by field held a different name: Arden Clare. The timestamp was from 4:37 p.m., the previous day, a time when I was verifiably in a meeting about OSHA regulations on a different floor. Someone had used my credentials to put the final approving touch on a fraudulent contract. The summons came an hour later. Victor Hale's executive assistant called my desk line, her voice a crisp, emotionless instrument. "Claire, Mr. Hale and Ms. Quinn would like to see you in the main boardroom, immediately." The walk to the boardroom felt like a mile. The polished hardwood floors seemed to suck the sound from my footsteps. Victor and Marla were seated at the far end of the long, reflective table. Darren was there too, standing near the window, his arms crossed, a somber expression on his face. He looked like a concerned mentor, worried for his protege. He was a phenomenal actor. "Claire, please, have a seat," Victor began. His calendar smile nowhere to be seen. His voice was grave, disappointed. Marla said nothing, her gaze as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Victor slid a printed document across the table. It was a manifest for a series of containers that had passed through Landry Cove the night before. "We've had a significant irregularity flagged by our internal systems," he said. "This is an authorization form for the expedited release of 5 containers, bypassing standard inspection. Your digital signature is on the approval line." I looked at the signature block. There it was. My name, my employee ID, time-stamped from the previous evening. A perfect forgery. I slowly lifted my eyes from the paper and looked directly at Darren. He met my gaze without flinching, a flicker of what looked like pity in his eyes. "It must be a system glitch," he said, his voice laced with just the right amount of confusion and concern. "Claire would never do something like this. There has to be a technical explanation." Marla finally spoke, her voice cutting through the air. "We have the technical explanation." She nodded to the large screen on the wall, which flickered to life. It displayed a system access log from the IT department. The authorization was logged at 10:14 p.m. last night. It was initiated from the auxiliary workstation in the 3rd floor conference room. She paused, letting the information sink in. It was accessed using a non-network keycard, a temporary staff badge. I felt the last piece of the frame slide into place, the spare badge, the one Darren had given me my first week, the one he had so conveniently forgotten to take back. They had used the key I didn't even know I possessed to create a crime I hadn't committed. The door was locked, and they had just shown me I was the one holding the key. This was the moment they expected me to panic, to deny, to cry, to accuse. They had a story. They had evidence, and they had a scapegoat. Protesting my innocence would be useless. It was my word against the company's digital records. It would be my final act of flailing before they drowned me. So I did the one thing they didn't expect. I remained perfectly still. I looked at the log on the screen, at the forged document on the table, and then back at the 3 of them. I let out a small, quiet breath. I nodded. "I see," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I let my shoulders slump, playing the part of the defeated employee. "This is a lot to take in." I looked up, feigning shock and confusion. May I please use the restroom for a moment?" Victor Hale, seeing his victory at hand, became magnanimous. "Of course, Claire. Take a moment to compose yourself." I stood up on unsteady legs, my movements deliberately slow and shaky. I walked out of the boardroom, past the executive assistant who refused to meet my eyes, and down the hall to the pristine, empty executive bathroom. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The silence was absolute. I leaned against the cool marble sink, my reflection a pale, blank mask in the mirror. I took a deep, steadying breath. My hands were not shaking. My heart was not racing. It was beating with a slow, cold, and methodical rhythm. They thought they were staging an execution. They had no idea they were officiating a baptism. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal phone. I opened a secure messaging app, one that left no trace on any server. I selected the notary's contact from a list of coded names. My thumb hovered over the screen. This was the point of no return. This was the public declaration of war. I typed a single, 4-word message, the prearranged signal. Begin breach validation. I hit send. The message disappeared, sent into the encrypted void. The first domino had fallen. I flushed the toilet for effect, splashed cold water on my face, and composed my features into a mask of resignation. When I walked back into that boardroom, they would see a broken employee ready to sign a confession. They would not see the woman who had just activated a $10 million weapon aimed directly at the heart of their company. When I returned to the boardroom, I was the picture of shell-shocked compliance. I didn't sit down. I stood by the door, hugging my arms, and mumbled something about needing to think. Victor Hale, radiating magnanimity in his perceived victory, agreed. "Take the rest of the day. Claire," he said gently, "we'll talk tomorrow about a mutually agreeable path forward." It was a firing, wrapped in the silken language of corporate compassion. They had given me a timeline. They thought it was for me to accept my fate. In reality, it was my operational window. Back at my desk, the air was thick with the unsaid. My neighboring colleagues were suddenly fascinated by their spreadsheets. Avoiding my gaze, I ignored them. I was not Claire Arden, the disgraced employee. I was a technician at a control panel, and a sequence had been initiated. My message to the notary, "Begin breach validation," had unlocked the first of 3 gates. It authorized him to accept the evidence package I was about to send. Now, I had to build that package. I sat down, my posture deliberately slumped, my face a mask of weary defeat. Then my fingers began to move. My first action was an email, sent not to my superiors, but to the head of port logistics, a gruff, overworked man named Alistair. The subject line was innocuous. Query re, system log anomaly, Landry Cove shipments. In the body, I framed my request as a piece of diligent, self-preserving housekeeping. "Alistair," I wrote, "in a review meeting today, a potential system glitch was identified related to my credentials and a series of container authorizations from last night. See attached manifest. To help it troubleshoot the source of the error, could you please forward the raw data package for these 5 containers? Specifically, I need the high-resolution intake photos of the door seals and the unedited GPS logs from port entry to exit. I'm just trying to create a full paper trail to clear this up. Thanks, Claire." It was the perfect request. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea for help. To refuse would be an immediate red flag. Alistair, likely having heard nothing of the boardroom drama, complied within the hour. A link to a secure server appeared in my inbox. My mouse clicked. The download began. I opened the files in a specific order, creating a digital workspace on my second monitor. Manifest on the left, GPS logs in the center, a folder of high-resolution JPEGs on the right, one by one. I dragged the photos and matched them to the container numbers on the manifest. Container 1, seal number 9F84C2. Match. Container 2, seal number 3A77B9. Match. Then I got to the third container on the list from the fraudulent authorization. Container 3, seal number 5A8. I opened the photo. The number was crisp, clear, stenciled in black on a metal tag. Then I opened the photo for container 4. My breath caught. The same number, 5E11D8. My fingers flew, opening the photo for container 5. There it was again, 5E11D8. It was a physical impossibility. Every shipping container seal has a unique serial number, precisely to prevent tampering and ensure chain of custody. 3 separate containers, logged at 3 different times, could not have the same seal. It was not a system glitch. It was counterfeit. It was hard. photographic proof that the containers had been tampered with. Their original, legitimate seals replaced with fraudulent, identical ones before the official intake photos were taken. This was the work of Seawind Apex. This was the crime. My next click was on my contact list. I found the number for the Landry Cove Port Contractor's main office, the public face, not the shell company. I dialed. Landry Cove Operations, a voice answered. Hello, my name is Claire Arden, calling from the Corporate Compliance Department at Orion Freight Systems, I said, my voice level and professional. There was a half-second of dead air. Then a click. The line went dead. They didn't ask what I wanted. They didn't put me on hold. The sound of my name connected to the word compliance was enough. They hung up. It was a confession delivered in a single panicked action. Now for the final piece. I minimized the evidence and opened a new document. It was a formal internal memorandum, addressed directly to Victor Hale and Marla Quinn, with Darren Cole CC'd. Subject: Urgent. Findings from preliminary review of Landry Cove data anomaly. In the driest, most dispassionate language I could muster, I laid out the facts. I detailed the impossible duplication of seal numbers on containers 3, 4, and 5. I noted the unresponsiveness of the Landry Cove contractor. I attached the original Seawind Apex contract with its wiped metadata. I did not make accusations. I simply presented the data. I concluded with a single, devastating recommendation. Given these serious discrepancies, which indicate a potential compromise in cargo security and regulatory adherence, I strongly recommend the immediate temporary suspension of the Seawind Apex contract and a full third-party forensic audit of all Landry Cove priority shipments for the past fiscal year. I hit send. It was a checkmate move disguised as a helpful suggestion. They could not ignore it, because now there was a formal time-stamped record of my warning, and they could not accept it, because a real audit would uncover everything. Victor's reply came in less than 10 minutes. It was a masterpiece of dismissive corporate paternalism. Claire, thank you for your diligence. We appreciate you looking into this. The team will take it from here. It sounds like you've been under a great deal of stress lately. Why don't you take a paid leave of absence for a few days? On us? Rest and recharge. We'll have this all sorted out when you get back. I saved his email as a PDF. It was Exhibit D. Management notified and willfully ignored a credible internal threat. The evidence was complete. I turned to the printer beside my desk. The quiet hum, a comforting sound. One by one, I printed everything. The forged authorization with my name, the IT access logs, the high-resolution photos of the impossible seals, the Seawind Apex contract, my formal memorandum, and Victor's patronizing dismissal. The stack of paper grew, warm to the touch. I collated it all into 3 identical dossiers. From my desk drawer, I pulled out 3 large, bright blue manila envelopes. They were distinctive, impossible to mistake for inter-office mail. I slid one dossier into each, the paper whispering as it went in. I sealed them, running my thumb firmly along the adhesive strip. I didn't use the company mailroom. I put on my coat, walked out the front door of Sterling Point Tower with my head held high, and went to the official U.S. post office 3 blocks away. I paid for certified mail with return receipt requested for all 3. The first was addressed to the Notary Public in Rivermont, a name that meant nothing to anyone at Orion. This was the official evidence package, the key to unlocking the trust. The second was addressed to the Office of the Inspector General, Corinth State Transportation Commission, in the state capital. This was the public bomb. The third was addressed to my own home apartment, my insurance policy. I dropped them into the mail slot, the metallic clatter echoing with a profound finality. The process was now irreversible. Back in the office, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows. I sat at my desk and completed the final step. From my bag, I removed the small, featureless cold wallet token. I plugged it into my personal laptop, which was firewalled from Orion's network. I entered my passphrase. The device's tiny e-ink screen flickered to life, displaying a simple interface. I navigated to the signature authorization protocol and ran a diagnostic. The system checked its connection to the encrypted network that linked it to the trust's administrators. After a few seconds, a single word appeared on the screen in stark, black letters. Ready. The system was armed. It was waiting for the public confirmation from the State Transportation Commission. The last hour of the day I spent erasing myself. I shredded my notes. I deleted my browser history. I wiped the caches. I methodically packed my personal effects, my spare mug, my photos, my books, into my bag. I wanted them to find a desk that was almost entirely barren, the desk of someone who knew they were leaving, but I left one thing behind. In the exact center of the cleared, polished desk space, I placed the small, spiky cactus in its terracotta pot. It was a symbol they would only understand in retrospect, a thing that survives on nothing, a thing that is far more dangerous than it looks. I wanted them to walk past in the morning, see that cactus, and think I was a naive girl, still hoping to come back to water her plant. I wanted them to be utterly, completely, and devastatingly wrong. The digital ghost appeared at 1:12 a.m. In the silent, refrigerated server farm that was the heart of Orion Freight Systems. A line of code was written into the master security log. User ID, Arden C, action, bulk data access, target directory, /Orion Global Logistics, Landry Coves, active. It was an electronic whisper, a flicker of light in a city of sleeping machines, a perfect crime, logged for all to see. An hour later, a night shift security guard doing his rounds on the 23rd floor noticed a sliver of light under a conference room door. He pushed it open. Inside, the vast table reflected the city lights like a black, placid lake. On its surface sat a single auxiliary laptop, its screen glowing. It was logged in. The user was Claire Arden. Protruding from its side was a small generic USB flash drive, its indicator light blinking with a steady, patient rhythm. The guard followed protocol, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He took a photo, logged the time, and called his supervisor. The evidence was secured. The frame was complete. When I walked into the lobby at 8:45 a.m., the atmosphere was different. The usual morning bustle was muted. The receptionist looked up, her eyes wide for a fraction of a second before she snapped her gaze back to her monitor. As I stepped out of the elevator on my floor, the low hum of conversation ceased. It was like walking into a vacuum. People who had smiled at me yesterday were now intensely focused on their work. Their shoulders hunched. I was already a ghost. I hadn't even reached my desk when a woman from Human Resources, flanked by 2 uniformed security guards, intercepted me. Her expression was one of practiced sympathy. "Claire," she said, her voice soft but firm, "can you come with us, please? We need you to bring your personal belongings." They didn't take me to an office. They simply stood there, an impassive honor guard, as I packed the contents of my desk into a small cardboard box. The process was sterile and swift. I didn't have much: a mug, a few books, a spare charger. They watched as I placed my laptop and notebooks into my bag. I didn't touch the cactus. I left it in the center of the desk, a silent, green sentinel. The walk to the elevators was the longest of my life. Every head on the floor was turned, their faces a mixture of pity, curiosity, and a dark kind of relief that it wasn't them. The 2 guards walked slightly behind me, their presence a clear signal to everyone. This is a pariah, a threat. They were making an example of me. They were painting their story of my betrayal in broad, public strokes. As we waited for the elevator, its arrival announced by a soft, metallic chime, I slipped a hand into my coat pocket. My thumb found my phone. They thought they had cut me off, isolated me. They were wrong. Under the watchful eye of the security camera, I typed a single, 2-word message to the Trust's lead counsel, a man I knew only as Mr. Sterling. Event horizon. It was the final authorization, the point of no return, the signal that the public breach was now matched by my own private one, and that all protocols were to be executed without further contact. I hit send just as the elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside. The HR woman beside me, the guards behind, the doors closed, sealing me off from the world I had so carefully infiltrated. They thought they were throwing me into the abyss. They had no idea I was the abyss. 9:07 a.m. In a quiet, third-floor office in a nondescript building across town. My notary, a meticulous man named Mr. Alcott, signed for a certified mail delivery. He saw the distinctive blue envelope and the return address from the State Transportation Commission's public filing office. Following his notarized instructions, he unlocked his safe, retrieved the sealed digital wallet I had left with him, and placed it on his desk. He then took the blue envelope he had just received from me, scanned its contents, and time-stamped the digital copies. He uploaded the encrypted files, the photos of the seals, the internal memos, Victor's dismissal of my warning, to the secure server specified in his instructions. His system sent out 2 automated, encrypted notifications, one to me, one to Mr. Sterling. The message was simple: package received and validated, lock sequence engaged. 11:30 a.m. On the official website of the Corinth State Transportation Commission, under the Public Notices section, a new entry appeared. It was dry, bureaucratic, and utterly explosive. Notice of formal inquiry. File number CSTC 2-25-914. The Commission acknowledges receipt of a formal whistleblower complaint, accompanied by supporting evidentiary materials, alleging systemic regulatory non-compliance and potential cargo manifest fraud by the licensed freight carrier Orion Freight Systems, specifically concerning operations at the Landry Cove Port Facility. An official investigation has been opened. The notice sat there for 11 minutes before a junior reporter at the Rivermont Gazette, doing his routine daily search of state dockets, saw the name Orion Freight Systems. 3:12 p.m. The first tremor hit the market. A headline on the Gazette's website read, "State launches investigation into Orion Freight Systems over manifest fraud allegations." The story was thin on details, but it contained the 2 words that terrify investors more than any others: federal investigation. Phones began ringing on trading desks across the country. Orion's stock, a reliable blue-chip performer, dipped 3%, but the real damage was happening in the more obscure, less liquid bond market. The value of Orion's B-rated corporate bonds, the very debt the Camden Remnant Trust was built to hunt, began to slide. By 3:45, it was down 11%. A cascade of automated sell orders triggered, pushing it even lower. The whispers that had once been confined to Orion's break rooms were now screaming across the financial world. 5:45 p.m. And not an office that didn't exist on any public record. Mr. Sterling watched the numbers on his screen. The price of Orion's bonds had stabilized, for the moment, having shed a catastrophic amount of their value. The major institutional holders were panicking, trying to offload what was now perceived as toxic debt before it fell further. He picked up a secure phone line. "It's time," he said, his voice calm and even. "Begin acquisition. Execute protocol remnant. Target price is 62 cents on the dollar. Buy everything you can get." As the sun set over Rivermont, casting long shadows from the Sterling Point Tower, a wave of buy orders flooded the market. They were quiet, anonymous, absorbed by the chaos of the sell-off, but they were relentless. The Camden Remnant Trust, a charity on paper, a predator in practice, began to feed. They weren't just buying bonds. They were buying control. They were buying the rope. My $10 million inheritance, amplified by the panic I had engineered, was being transformed from money into power. They had thrown a bucket of paint on me in the morning, hoping to stain me forever. By evening, I was pulling the plug on the ocean, ready to drown them all. The call came 2 days later. The stock was in freefall. The media was circling, and the company was hemorrhaging credibility. It was Victor Hale's executive assistant. Her voice, once a crisp instrument of authority, was strained, brittle. Claire, Mr. Hale would like you to come to the office, to the main boardroom. They're ready to discuss your departure. The word she used was discuss. It was a lie. This was a summons for a surrender. When I stepped into the boardroom, the scene was a tableau of corporate power under siege. Victor stood by the window, staring down at the city he believed he owned. Marla Quinn was at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her face a mask of controlled fury. Darren Cole was there, too. Slumped in a chair in the corner, looking pale and shrunken, a man who had made a deal with the devil and was only now realizing the devil was collecting. They all looked at me as I entered. I met each of their gazes. Victor's was filled with a cold, personal hatred. Marla's was pure, venomous calculation. Darren couldn't hold my eye for more than a second before looking away at the floor. "Claire," Marla began, her voice like chipping ice. She pushed a thick, leather-bound document across the gleaming surface of the table. It slid to a stop directly in front of me. "This is a separation agreement. It is, under the circumstances, extraordinarily generous." I didn't look at it. I looked at her. "It includes a substantial severance package," she continued, a slight tremor in her voice the only sign of the pressure she was under. "In return, you will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement, and you will issue a public statement retracting your baseless allegations, attributing them to a personal grievance." Victor turned from the window, a smile playing on his lips that was devoid of all warmth. It was the smile of a predator that has cornered its prey and is preparing to enjoy the kill. "Sign it, Claire," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Sign it, and we will take care of your professional record. We will make sure this unfortunate misunderstanding doesn't follow you. We'll even help you find a new position, somewhere far from here." The threat was unmistakable. "Sign, or we will destroy you. We will salt the earth of your career so that nothing ever grows again." I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. I let them savor their perceived power. Then, slowly, I reached into my own leather satchel, which I placed on the table. My movements were calm, deliberate. I withdrew a single, bright blue manila envelope. It was identical to the ones I had mailed 2 days before. I placed it on the table next to their separation agreement, the stark blue against the rich. Dark wood was a declaration. The sound it made was soft, but it echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. "If I sign your agreement," I said, my voice steady and clear, "it will be meaningless." Marla's eyes narrowed. "And why is that?" "Because the document you want me to sign is intended to stop a process that has already started." I explained, not looking at them, but at the 2 documents sitting side by side. "Your offer is for Stage 1. The activation sequence for the breach covenant is already past Stage 2. Victor let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of genuine disbelief. "What are you talking about? Breach covenant? You're an unemployed compliance officer, not a corporate raider." Right on cue, the boardroom door opened. It didn't creak. It swung open with a silent, confident weight. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped inside. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and an air of quiet, unshakable authority. He carried a slim leather briefcase. It was Mr. Sterling, lead counsel for the Camden Remnant Trust. He closed the door behind him and walked to the table, placing his briefcase beside me with a soft click of its latches. He nodded to me, then turned his gaze to Victor and Marla. It was the gaze of a surgeon looking at a tumor he was about to excise. "Victor Hale, Marla Quinn," he began, his voice filling the room, calm and resonant. "My name is Alistair Sterling. I am the legal representative for the Camden Remnant Trust. I'm here to inform you that, as of the market's close yesterday, the Trust has acquired a controlling interest in Orion Freight Systems Series B unsecured bond issuance. We currently hold a 27% position." He paused, letting the weight of the number settle in the room. "This position is sufficient to invoke the covenant of preservation in the event of a certified standards breach, which, I believe, is the matter at hand." Marla's mask of composure finally shattered. A flicker of raw, naked confusion crossed her face. "The Camden Remnant Trust?" she repeated, the name tasting alien in her mouth. "What in God's name is that?" I answered her. I leaned forward slightly, my hands flat on the table, and I spoke the words I had rehearsed in my mind 1,000 times. I looked directly into her eyes. "It's a charitable remainder trust," I said slowly, enunciating every syllable. "Its charter is very specific. It was designed to protect the long-term interests of a company's employees when its leadership engages in practices that violate established legal and ethical standards." A vein began to throb in Victor's temple. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen. "This is insane," he snarled, taking a step forward. "You can't be in this room. This is a private meeting. You have no standing here. You have no rights." I didn't answer him. Instead, I reached into my satchel again and took out my iPad. I unlocked the screen and turned it to face him. The display glowed with the letterhead of the Corinth State Transportation Commission. It was a scanned copy of the letter that had been delivered to my apartment that morning. My insurance policy. "You're right, Victor," I said quietly. "I have no rights in this room, but the trust does, and its right to act was triggered yesterday afternoon." I pointed a single finger to a highlighted paragraph on the screen, and I read the words aloud into the dead, still air of the boardroom. "Pursuant to the evidence submitted in file 2925914, a preliminary review has been conducted. Initial evidentiary verification of the complaint is confirmed. A full, formal investigation will now commence." I set the iPad down on the table, the screen still glowing with the words of their damnation. The room went silent. It was a profound, absolute silence, the kind that follows an explosion. In that moment, the power in the room didn't just shift, it inverted. Victor Hale stared at the iPad, his mouth slightly agape, the arrogant smirk wiped clean from his face, replaced by a look of dawning, sickening horror. Marla Quinn sank back into her chair, her face ashen. She looked from the iPad to me, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at a subordinate she had crushed. She was looking at an architect. She was looking at the woman who had designed and built the cage that was now closing around them. The execution was over. The transfer of ownership was about to begin. The silence in the boardroom was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a physical pressure, a weight that seemed to bend the very air. Mr. Sterling did not wait for an invitation to speak. He opened his briefcase and laid out a single, precisely folded document. "As the representative for the principal creditor in this matter," he began, his voice the calm, dispassionate instrument of legal fact, "and pursuant to Section 11.4 of the bond indenture, which is triggered by a confirmed regulatory investigation, we formally request an emergency meeting of creditors and the board of directors to be convened within the next 48 hours. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Victor and Marla. "We also hereby invoke our right to appoint a non-voting observer to the board, effective immediately, to ensure full transparency during the restructuring process." Victor found his voice, a ragged, desperate sound. "Restructuring? This is a temporary market panic based on a disgruntled employee's lies." "The markets disagree," Sterling replied coolly, "and so do your other major creditors." He gestured subtly to his phone, which lay face up on the table. "I have just concluded a conference call with representatives from Meridian Trust and First National Commerce Bank. They are, shall we say, deeply concerned about the security of their assets. They have agreed that a creditor-led recovery plan is the only viable path forward. They have agreed to vote as a block with the Camden Remnant Trust to protect their investment from any further mismanagement." He had flanked them, in the space of a single phone call. Victor and Marla were no longer negotiating with a lone, mysterious entity. They were facing a united front of their financiers. Their allies had abandoned them. Sterling wasn't finished. He slid a second document from his briefcase. "Furthermore, the activation of the breach covenant has also unlocked a secondary clause in our agreement. One which is non-negotiable for our continued support. I've been instructed to inform you of the immediate formation of the Orion Employee Welfare Fund. Marla, who had been staring at the table as if trying to calculate an escape route, looked up sharply. The what? An employee trust, Sterling explained, a flicker of something almost like satisfaction in his eyes. The clause stipulates that 20% of the company's common stock is to be transferred, in a phased, 4-year vesting schedule, into this fund. It is, in effect, an employee stock ownership plan. The shares held by the fund will be non-voting until fully vested and are subject to a 10-year lock against any block sale, preventing a hostile dilution. He had just announced that a fifth of their company no longer belonged to the shareholders, but to the workers they had exploited. It was a takeover from below, funded by their own malfeasance. The pressure was now suffocating. With the backing of the banks, Sterling made his next demand. To facilitate a transparent recovery, we require full, uncensored access to all internal communications and system logs related to Landry Cove operations for the past 24 months. Marla's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. It was a demand she could not refuse without admitting guilt. Our IT security protocols are now subject to creditor oversight, Sterling finished for her, his tone leaving no room for argument. We have a forensic team on standby, or you can provide the access logs voluntarily. I assure you, the former will be far more disruptive. For an hour, Marla fought, her arguments a flurry of technical jargon and procedural roadblocks, but she had no leverage. Finally, defeated, she made a call. The logs were provided. Sterling's forensic specialist, connected remotely, went to work. The boardroom was silent again. The only sound the quiet tapping of Sterling's pen on a legal pad. After 15 minutes, Sterling's laptop chimed. He turned the screen toward Marla. The digital signature on the container authorization, the one that framed Ms. Arden, was initiated from an auxiliary workstation. That workstation's MAC address and IP login history place it at the desk of Darren Cole for 3 months prior to the incident. He looked over at the man shrinking in the corner. It was moved to the conference room on the 23rd floor, 30 minutes before the fraudulent access was logged. The authorization to move the machine was signed by you, Mr. Cole. The digital trail was a straight, clean line, leading directly from the crime back to the man who had been chosen to be the instrument of my downfall. Darren Cole slowly, shakily, pushed himself to his feet. Every eye was on him. He opened his mouth, his face a mess of fear and shame. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for something. Forgiveness? Understanding? I offered him nothing but a cool, level stare. He looked at Victor and Marla, who glared back at him, their expressions telling him to keep his mouth shut. He was a loose end they now needed to tie off. He saw the trap closing around him from all sides. His shoulders slumped. The words he was about to speak died in his throat. He sank back into his chair. With a final defeated gesture, he reached up, unclipped his Orion employee badge from his shirt, and placed it on the table in front of him. It was a silent confession, a surrender. With the conspiracy now laid bare, Sterling turned his attention to Victor. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice now devoid of any pretense of negotiation. "The creditor bloc has lost all confidence in your leadership. We strongly suggest you take an immediate and indefinite leave of absence. The board's independent chairman, Mr. Kenwood, has agreed to step in as interim CEO, pending creditor approval." The final piece of the lock clicked into place. The interim CEO would serve at the pleasure of the creditors, and the trust was now the most powerful creditor. Victor was out. His kingdom had been taken from him without a single share of stock being sold. I stood up. I walked to the head of the table, to the spot where Marla had sat, and placed my hands on the back of the chair. I didn't ask for my job back. I had no interest in being an employee of this company ever again. "I have a list of recommendations," I said, my voice clear and carrying in the stunned silence. "They are the conditions for the trust's cooperation in preventing a full liquidation. I picked up a document Sterling had placed on the table. It was my real report, my final act of compliance. One, a full, independent, third-party forensic audit of the last 3 years of operations, with the report to be made public. 2. Mandatory installation of tamper-proof cameras on all container seals at all port facilities, with a live feed accessible to a new, independent compliance committee. 3. Full and immediate restitution of all unpaid overtime to all hourly employees, retroactive for the past 5 years, with interest. I read the list like a judge passing sentence. I was not just cleaning house, I was rebuilding it on a foundation of transparency, brick by painful brick. Later that day, the preliminary findings of the newly formed Internal Oversight Committee, headed by the interim CEO and observed by Mr. Sterling, were released in a company-wide memo. The language was cold and brutal. The irregularities at Landry Cove were not the result of clerical errors or the actions of a single rogue employee. The report concluded the breach was systemic, coordinated, and represented a fundamental failure of executive oversight. It wasn't a mistake, it was a business model, and I had just foreclosed on it. I walked out of the boardroom alone. The heavy door closed behind me with a soft, hydraulic hiss, sealing the wreckage in. The hallway was empty, a long corridor of glass and steel under the cool, impartial glow of recessed lighting. The silence was immense, a stark contrast to the implosion of careers and a corporate dynasty I had just witnessed. My footsteps on the polished stone floor were the only sound, each one a small, distinct report. I was not fleeing, I was exiting. I was halfway to the elevators when I heard his hurried, clumsy footsteps behind me. "Claire." It was Darren. I stopped but did not turn. I watched his reflection approach in the smoked glass wall beside me, a disheveled, broken man, his face pale and slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. He stopped a few feet away, breathing heavily. "Claire, please," he stammered, his voice a raw, pleading whisper. I needed the tuition for the kid, for Sarah. That's all it was. They had me. I had no choice." The excuse hung in the sterile air between us, pathetic and small. He was offering me a reason, as if a reason would change the fundamental mechanics of what he had done. I finally turned to face him, my expression unreadable. I looked at this man who had called himself my mentor, who had handed me the spare keycard with a fatherly smile and then used it to sign my professional death warrant. "I left the employees a fund," I said, my voice quiet, level, and devoid of heat. It was a simple statement of fact. "The Orion Employee Welfare Fund. It contains a provision for educational grants in cases of financial hardship." I paused, letting the words find their mark. "You're welcome to apply for aid." The cruelty of it was not in raising my voice, but in the absolute clinical neutrality of the offer. I had not just beaten him, I had rendered his grand betrayal into a mundane administrative problem, for which he was now a supplicant. The last bit of color drained from his face. He seemed to shrink, the fight and the excuses dissolving into a profound and terrible shame. He had sold his soul for his daughter's tuition, and I was now offering to cover it with charity. He said nothing. He just stood there, a hollowed-out man in an expensive suit. The boardroom door hissed open again. Marla Quinn emerged. Her face was a tightly controlled mask, but her eyes, when they met mine, were different. The cold fire was gone, replaced by a kind of sharp, predatory curiosity. She was no longer an executioner. She was an analyst studying an anomaly she could not compute. She walked toward us, her sharp-toed shoes making no sound on the thick runner that led to the executive suites. She stopped and looked from Darren's broken form to me. "Whose fund is that?" she asked. Her voice was a low murmur, a question not for the record, but for herself. She was a woman who understood power, and she was trying to understand the source of the power that had just dismantled her world. I met her gaze. "It belongs to the people who sweat," I said, "not the ones who sign fake invoices." It was the only explanation I would ever give. It was a moral declaration, a final rebalancing of the scales. She held my gaze for a long moment. A flicker of something, understanding, perhaps, or even a grudging respect, in her eyes. Then she gave a single, sharp nod and walked away down the hall, her back perfectly straight, a queen leaving a kingdom that was no longer hers. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. A new message. The sender ID was Victor Hale. I opened it. The message was 5 words long. "We can still make a deal." I stared at the words, at the desperate, pathetic reach from a man who still believed that everything, even his own destruction, was negotiable. He still thought this was about money. I pressed my thumb to the screen, but not to reply. I blocked his number. Then I slid the phone back into my pocket. Some messages are best answered with silence. Mr. Sterling met me at the elevator bank. He had a small, satisfied smile on his face. The doors opened, and we stepped inside, the polished chrome reflecting our muted forms. "The interim board will be seated by Friday," he said as the elevator began its smooth, silent descent. "Kenwood will clean house. This will be a different company in 6 months." He turned to me. "They will almost certainly offer you a senior role, Executive Vice President of Compliance, perhaps a seat on the new board. Even, is that something you would want?" I watched the floor numbers descend. 48, 47, 46. I thought about the corner office, the power, the title. I thought about sitting in the very chairs those people had just vacated, becoming a part of the machine I had just redesigned. "I didn't build a throne," I said, my voice quiet. "I built a fence." He nodded, understanding completely. My work was not to rule. It was to ensure that no one like Victor Hale could ever rule here again. The elevator opened onto my old floor. It was late, and the vast open-plan office was deserted, steeped in the bluish glow of security lights and sleeping computer monitors. On impulse, I stepped out. "I'll just be a moment," I told Sterling. I walked through the maze of empty cubicles, my footsteps a soft intrusion in the quiet. I found my old desk, barren except for the single object I had left behind, the small cactus, in its cheap terracotta pot. I had been gone for days. The air in the office was dry and recycled. No one had watered it. And yet, it was fine. It had survived. It had thrived on nothing. I picked it up, the rough texture of the pot familiar in my hand. It was the only thing from my 3 years at Orion that I wanted to keep. As I turned to leave, I reached into my bag and pulled out the last vestige of my old life. My employee ID card, Claire Arden, compliance officer, employee number 71B9. It felt like a relic from another person's life. I held it for a moment, the plastic cool against my skin. It had opened doors for me, given me access to the secrets I needed. Its purpose was served. I didn't throw it. I didn't break it. I simply let my fingers uncurl. It fell. It didn't make a loud noise. It hit the low-pile industrial carpet with a soft, final thud. The sound was small, insignificant in the vast, empty office, but it was the sound of a lock disengaging, a door closing. It was the sound of a period at the end of a very long sentence. The elevator did not go down to the lobby. I pressed the button for the roof. The car ascended with a soft, final hum, lifting me above the floors of cubicles and conference rooms, above the office where I had been both hunted and hunter. It carried me past the executive suite, where an empire had just been decapitated. The doors opened not to a hallway, but to the sky. The rooftop of the Sterling Point Tower was a stark, windswept expanse of concrete and gravel, populated only by vents and communication arrays. It was cold, the wind whipping in from the river, carrying the distant scent of industry and rain. I walked to the edge, the low parapet the only thing separating me from a 50-story drop. Below, the city of Rivermont was beginning to glitter as the late afternoon sun bled into a bruised purple dusk. The arteries of the streets filled with the headlights of rush-hour traffic, a silent, flowing river of light. The neon signs of the downtown businesses began to flicker to life, painting the growing darkness with reds and blues. This was the view from the top, a place of immense power and profound isolation. It was the view Victor Hale had seen every day, a vista he had mistaken for his kingdom. He had only ever looked down. I took out the encrypted phone Mr. Sterling had provided. There was only one number in its contact list, labeled simply Executor. It was the notary, Mr. Alcott. I pressed the call button. He answered on the first ring. "This is Alcott." His voice was dry, professional, devoid of curiosity. He was a perfect component in the machine. "This is the Protector," I said, using the title designated in the Trust's charter for the final time. The wind snatched at the words, trying to pull them away. "The active phase is complete. Lock the acquisition protocols." "Locking acquisition protocols," he confirmed, the sound of a keyboard clicking softly in the background. "Standing by for phase directive." "Initiate phase 2, I said. "The employee welfare mandate. Unlock the ESOT transfer and all associated social benefit provisions. The Camden Remnant Trust is now dormant. Its purpose is fulfilled." "Understood," he said. "Initiating employee welfare phase. The trust is now passive. Goodbye." The line went dead. I put the phone away and took out my own small laptop. I sat on the cold concrete of the parapet, my back to the city, and connected to the Trust's secure online portal. The interface was stark, text only. I navigated to the activity log. A new entry had appeared, timestamped to the exact second our call had ended. Status update. Phase 1, acquisition, locked. Phase 2, welfare mandate. Activated. Action. Initial 5% tranche of Orion common stock, ORS, transferred to ESOT subaccount 77B. Action. Provision 2.4A. Emergency Grant Fund. Now active. Application portal open. Sub-provision 2.4A1. Emergency Education Grant. Parameters. Available to all non-executive employees with minimum 12-month service. Status. Active. I stared at the last line, somewhere in the code, in the cold, impartial logic of the trust I had designed. A path had been opened. A path for a man like Darren Cole to get tuition for his daughter. A path that did not require him to sell his soul. He would have to apply. He would have to stand in a digital line with the dock workers and truck drivers he had helped to cheat. The system I had built did not offer forgiveness, but in its own way, it offered a chance at redemption, a clean road. I closed the laptop and sent one last text to Mr. Sterling. The press releases would begin tomorrow. The story of the mysterious charitable trust that had saved a hometown company. "Ensure my name is absent from all public statements and internal communications," I typed. "Claire Arden was a temporary compliance officer who resigned due to stress. She is irrelevant to the restructuring." His reply was immediate. "As you wish. She is already a ghost." I sat there for a long time, watching the city complete its transformation into a constellation of electric light. The wind was colder now. My phone vibrated against the hard surface of the parapet. I looked down. An unknown number. It was a local area code. My first instinct was to ignore it, to delete it, but curiosity won. I opened the message. It was from someone on the night shift, someone who had just gotten the memo about the immediate restoration of overtime pay, someone who had just received years of stolen wages back into their account. The message was short, no name, no punctuation, no emojis. "Thanks for the overtime." That was it. That was all. I read the 4 words over and over. It was not a thank you from a friend. It was a receipt from a stranger. A confirmation that the debt had been paid. It was enough. It was everything. I stood up and walked back to the edge, looking down at the endless flow of trucks moving in and out of the port district, their headlights like fireflies. The containers were still moving. Orion Freight Systems was still alive. Commerce had not stopped. But from this day forward, the seals on those containers would be real, the manifests would be accurate, and the men and women who drove those trucks and loaded those ships would be paid for every single minute of their time. The route was now clean. My grandparents had left me $10 million and a single instruction: to right what is wrong. You could not burn corruption out of the world. You could not legislate greed out of the human heart. But you could build a better machine. You could create a system with consequences. A system where the fence was stronger than the wolves. I looked out at the glittering, sprawling city of Rivermont, a city built on the backs of people who were owed a debt. I whispered the words into the wind, a final report to the two people who had trusted me with their legacy. After graduating, I quietly placed my grandparents' estate into the only vault that can't be robbed. People, the screen goes dark, the story ends. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Share your thoughts on Claire's story. And if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It also helps us out immensely if you hit that hype button. It tells the platform that this is a story worth hearing and helps it reach more people.